There is a specific kind of exhaustion that nobody has a name for. You are not sick, you are not lazy, you have not failed at anything obvious, nothing catastrophic has happened. And yet you wake up one day and you are just done. Done with people, done with the noise, done with showing up and giving everything you have, and still feeling like somehow it is never quite enough. Done with trying to explain yourself to a world that never quite seems to understand you. You are tired of everything. And the worst part is that you cannot even fully explain why. If that feeling is familiar, you are not alone. And more importantly, you are not broken. Carl Jung, one of the most influential psychiatrists in the history of modern psychology, spent decades sitting across from people who felt exactly the way you feel right now. Patient after patient arrived at his clinic carrying this same unnamed exhaustion, overwhelmed, isolated, socially drained in ways they could not articulate, convinced that something was fundamentally wrong with them. And what Jung discovered about these people did not just change psychology, it changed the way we understand human consciousness altogether. Because Jung found that the exhaustion these people were carrying was not a sign of weakness. It was not evidence of mental illness. It was not proof that they were too fragile for the real world. It was the predictable result of a very specific psychological gift being used in the wrong direction for a very long time. And once you understand what that gift actually is, and what it was meant to do, the exhaustion starts to make a different kind of sense, not as a dead end, as a turning point. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that nobody talks about openly. It is not the kind that comes from working too many hours, or from not sleeping enough, or from trying to do too much in too little time. This exhaustion goes deeper than the body. It settles into the bones. It wraps itself around the soul. And the people who feel it most intensely are usually the ones who care the most, give the most, and hurt the most quietly. If you have ever felt completely drained by a conversation that other people walked away from just fine, you know what I am talking about. If you have ever walked into a room and immediately sensed that something was wrong, even though everyone around you was smiling and acting normal, you know what I am talking about. And if you have ever been told that you are too sensitive, too emotional, or too intense, just for noticing things that other people either could not see or simply chose to ignore, then what you are about to hear is going to change the way you understand yourself forever. Jung found that the people who struggle the most in this world are not struggling because they are broken. They are struggling because they are built differently. And that difference, once understood and properly developed, is not a weakness at all. It is one of the most powerful psychological gifts a human being can possess. Let us start with something that might sound strange at first. Jung believed that most of human life is governed not by what we consciously think and decide, but by invisible psychological forces that we are barely aware of. He called this territory the unconscious, and he spent his entire career mapping it. What Jung discovered is that the unconscious is not just personal, it is also collective. Every society, every family, every group of people shares a kind of invisible, emotional atmosphere. A web of unspoken agreements, buried feelings, denied truths, and suppressed fears that nobody talks about directly, but that everyone can feel if they pay close enough attention. Most people do not pay close attention. They go through their days interacting with the surface layer of life, the conversations people choose to have, the emotions people choose to show, the stories people choose to tell about themselves. They take things at face value, and for the most part, that works fine for them. But there is a small percentage of people for whom that surface layer is almost impossible to focus on because they are constantly perceiving what is underneath it. They notice the tension in someone's voice that does not match the cheerful words coming out of their mouth. They feel the sadness behind a colleague's joke. They sense the hostility in a room where everyone is being perfectly polite. They pick up on the fear hiding underneath someone's confidence, the loneliness behind someone's laughter, the anger beneath someone's silence. And this is not something they consciously choose to do. It is simply how they experience reality. Jung called this differentiated intuitive perception, and he documented it extensively in his clinical work, particularly in patients he would classify as the introverted intuitive type. These are people whose primary way of experiencing the world is through direct perception of unconscious contents, meaning they naturally and involuntarily pick up on emotional and psychological information that most people are completely unaware of. Jung estimated that this specific psychological profile represents roughly 1% of the population. But the broader category of highly sensitive people, a term that researcher Elaine Aron later formalized and studied extensively, accounts for closer to 20% of all human beings. What this means is that somewhere between 1 and 20% of people are walking through life experiencing a significantly richer, more intense, and more emotionally complex version of reality than the people around them. And most of them have spent their entire lives being told that this is a problem. Here is where Jung's work gets personal. The patients who came to Jung with this gift, because that is ultimately what it is, did not arrive at his office feeling gifted. They arrived exhausted. They arrived confused. They arrived apologizing for themselves. And they had very good reasons for feeling that way, because the world had been telling them for years, sometimes decades, that the way they experienced life was wrong. Think about what it would be like to grow up with this kind of perception. You are a child, and you can feel things that nobody around you is acknowledging. You sense that your parents are unhappy, even when they say everything is fine. You feel the tension at the dinner table that no one will name. You notice that your friend is being treated badly at home, even though she never talks about it. You pick up on the dynamic in your classroom, who has power and who does not, who is hurting and who is hiding it. And when you try to talk about these things, what do you hear? You are imagining things. You are being too sensitive. You are creating drama. Mind your own business. Stop being so emotional. Everything is fine. Why do you always have to make everything so complicated? So you learn. You learn to stop naming what you see. You learn to swallow what you feel. You learn to question your own perceptions. You learn to prioritize other people's comfort over your own clarity. And over time, you develop what might be the most exhausting habit a person can have, which is the habit of constantly monitoring your inner experience and suppressing the parts of it that make other people uncomfortable. Jung documented this pattern in his clinical notes again and again. He described patients who had been systematically trained to distrust their own most reliable faculty, their perception. And he noted something deeply troubling about what this kind of self-suppression does to a person over time. It does not just make them quieter, it makes them invisible, even to themselves. Now here is something that Jung observed that cuts right to the heart of why so many highly perceptive people end up in so much pain. These individuals do not just feel more deeply than others. They also care more deeply. And those two things together create a combination that makes them extraordinarily vulnerable to a specific kind of relational dynamic. Jung noticed that in almost every highly sensitive patient he treated, there was a consistent pattern in their relationships. These people had become what he called emotional shock absorbers for the people around them. In their families, they were the ones who sensed when a parent was stressed and quietly adjusted their behavior to avoid adding to it. They were the ones who noticed when a sibling was struggling and stepped up to help, often without being asked. They were the ones who absorbed the emotional atmosphere of the household and did their best to smooth it over, to keep the peace, to hold things together. In their friendships, they were the ones who always listened, always checked in, always showed up when someone needed them. They gave their full attention and their full empathy freely, often to people who gave very little back. In their romantic relationships, they were the ones who understood their partners more deeply than their partners understood themselves, who anticipated needs, who worked overtime to maintain connection, who blamed themselves when things went wrong. And in their workplaces, they were the ones who could read the room, who knew instinctively how to navigate difficult personalities, who quietly managed the emotional undercurrents of team dynamics while being given zero credit for it. Does any of this sound familiar? Jung noted that this pattern had a seductive logic to it. If you can feel what other people feel, if you can understand what they need before they can even articulate it themselves, then it makes a kind of sense to use that ability in service of others. It feels like the responsible thing to do. It feels like what a good person does. But here's the problem that Jung identified. When you spend your entire life using your perception outward, scanning the emotional environment around you and responding to what you find there, you stop using your perception inward. You stop paying attention to what you yourself need. You stop trusting your own instincts about when a situation is harmful to you. You get so good at managing other people's inner worlds that you lose track of your own. And because your empathy is genuine, because you actually do feel what others are going through, you become extraordinarily easy to take advantage of. Not always by people who are consciously manipulative, though sometimes that too, but often simply by people who are too absorbed in their own needs to notice that they are draining you dry. Jung wrote about this as one of the most dangerous positions a person can occupy psychologically. You are using your greatest strength in a way that is slowly destroying you. Your gift becomes your wound. But Jung did not stop there, because he observed something else in his patients, something that most people in these situations are completely unaware of. He noticed that even while they were absorbing everyone else's pain, minimizing their own experience, and questioning their own perceptions, the most sensitive people were also doing something extraordinary underneath the surface. They were paying attention. Not just the kind of surface-level attention most people give to their relationships. Deep, precise, almost forensic attention. They noticed every inconsistency. They cataloged every contradiction between what someone said and what that person's body language, tone, and behavior actually communicated. They tracked patterns over months and years. They accumulated an enormous amount of accurate information about the people in their lives. And then, because they had been trained to distrust their own perceptions, they filed all of that information away and did nothing with it. Jung found this pattern deeply significant, because what it meant was that these individuals were not naive. They were not blind. They were not in denial, in the ordinary sense of the word. They were something more complicated. They had access to extremely accurate information, and they were actively choosing not to act on it because they had been conditioned to believe that their perceptions were less reliable than the explanations and reassurances of the people around them. He documented case after case in which a patient had, for years, noticed clear signs of deception or dysfunction in a close relationship and had systematically explained those signs away. Not because they could not see them, but because seeing them clearly would have required them to trust themselves. And trusting themselves was something they had been trained not to do. Jung recognized this as a kind of slow-motion psychological tragedy. All of that perceptual accuracy, all of that emotional intelligence, all of that hard-earned understanding of human behavior being actively suppressed in service of maintaining relationships with people who were not always worth maintaining. And then something would happen. Something that Jung documented in case after case after case. A betrayal. Not a small one, not an ambiguous one that could be explained away or forgiven in an afternoon. A large, clear, undeniable betrayal. The kind that made it impossible to keep choosing the explanation over the evidence. The kind that forced a reckoning. Maybe it was discovering that a partner had been lying for years. Maybe it was finding out that a family member had been manipulating a situation that the empath had been trying so hard to hold together. Maybe it was a moment of sudden, clarifying cruelty from someone the empath had protected and defended and given everything to. Whatever the specific form it took, the effect was the same. It broke something open. Now, Jung noted that most people who watched empaths reach this breaking point expected a particular kind of response. They expected tears. They expected emotional collapse. They expected the kind of dramatic, chaotic reaction that people often associate with someone who feels things deeply. But that is not what happened. What happened instead was something that Jung described as one of the most striking transformations he ever witnessed in a clinical setting. The person became calm. Not the shallow calm of someone who is numb or in shock. A deep, clear, almost eerie calm, like the surface of a lake after the storm has passed and the water has finally gone still. Jung wrote about this calm with a kind of reverence in his private notes. He said it was the calm of someone who had finally, after years of struggle, stopped fighting against their own perception. The calm of someone who looked at the evidence in front of them and for the first time decided to believe it. Because what a betrayal of that magnitude does to a highly perceptive person is not destroy their trust in their own perceptions. It confirms it. It takes every observation they made, every pattern they noticed, every inconsistency they cataloged, every quiet alarm that went off in the back of their mind and then got suppressed, and it validates every single one. They were right all along. They knew. And now they know that they knew. And in that moment, something fundamental shifts. Because the thing that was keeping them stuck, the belief that their perceptions could not be trusted, that their instincts were too intense, that the people in their lives understood reality better than they did, that belief shatters. And what is underneath it is extraordinary. Jung called this moment shadow integration, under extreme duress. And to understand what that means, we need to spend a little time with one of the most important concepts in all of Jungian psychology, the shadow. In Jung's model of the human psyche, the shadow is the part of ourselves that we have rejected, suppressed, or refused to acknowledge. It is everything we have been told is unacceptable about ourselves. Everything we have learned to hide in order to be loved, approved of, and included. For most people, the shadow contains things like anger, selfishness, ambition, jealousy, desire for power, the parts of human nature that society teaches us to bury. But for highly empathic people, the shadow contains something different. It contains their own strength. Think about that for a moment. Because of the way highly sensitive people are typically raised and socialized, the things they learn to suppress are not primarily the dark or destructive impulses that most people carry in their shadows. The things they are taught to suppress are their own clarity, their own boundaries, their own anger, their own authority over their own inner experience. They are taught that being too certain is arrogant, that expressing anger is dangerous, that setting limits on what they will tolerate is selfish, that trusting their own perceptions over someone else's explanations is a form of emotional immaturity. And so all of that gets pushed down into the shadow. Not cruelty, not malice, not the desire to dominate others. Just the fundamental, healthy, completely legitimate conviction that they have the right to trust what they see, feel what they feel, and protect themselves accordingly. Shadow integration is the process of reclaiming all of that. And when it happens, Jung observed, it does not turn people into something darker or harder or colder. It makes them whole. It gives them back access to the full range of who they are. The care and the clarity together. The empathy and the boundaries together. The sensitivity and the strength together. The people Jung documented going through this process did not become less kind after their integration. They became more precisely kind. They did not stop caring about people. They started caring about themselves with equal seriousness. Jung described watching these individuals go through a period of remarkable change in the months following what he called the clarity event. They stopped over-explaining themselves, not because they became dismissive, but because they no longer felt that they owed anyone an explanation for having accurate perceptions. They stopped apologizing for their observations. Instead, they started voicing them, quietly, clearly, and without flinching. They stopped tolerating dynamics that required them to pretend not to see what they were seeing, not in a dramatic or confrontational way, simply by removing themselves from those dynamics. And perhaps most significantly, Jung noted, they stopped being afraid of the people who had previously made them feel afraid. This is one of the most striking things he documented. The people who had walked all over these individuals, the manipulative ones, the emotionally dishonest ones, the ones who had spent years relying on the empath's self-doubt as a mechanism of control, those people became visibly uncomfortable around the integrated empath. They could not explain exactly why, because the integrated empath was not hostile or aggressive. They were not issuing threats or making accusations. They were just present, steady, clear-eyed, impossible to destabilize, impossible to gaslight. And that, Jung observed, is terrifying to someone whose primary tool of influence is destabilization and dishonesty. He wrote about this in terms of what happens when a mirror becomes impossible to avoid. For years, the highly perceptive person had been playing the role of someone who reflected back exactly what others wanted to see. Now they were reflecting back what was actually there. And people who had been very carefully managing their reflection found that unbearable. I want to pause here and address something that might be coming up for you as you listen to this, because it comes up for a lot of people. There is a temptation, when hearing something like this, to want to identify the good guys and the bad guys, the pure empaths who suffer innocently, and the manipulators who exploit them, the victims and the predators. Clean categories that let us know exactly how to feel. Jung was deeply skeptical of that kind of thinking. Not because he denied that harmful dynamics exist, they absolutely do, but because he believed, and his clinical work supported this, that the journey toward integration requires something more uncomfortable than simply identifying who hurt you. It requires looking honestly at the ways you participated, not as a form of self-blame, not to excuse the behavior of anyone who genuinely mistreated you, but because there is a crucial difference between being a passive victim and being someone who has unconsciously colluded in a dynamic that was hurting them. Highly perceptive people often see the harm coming long before it arrives. They feel the red flags. They sense the misalignment between who someone presents themselves to be and who they actually are. And then they override all of that because they want to believe the best, because they are afraid of conflict, or because their need for connection outweighs their instinct for self-protection. Jung called this a failure to honor the superior function, your greatest ability, your perception, and then actively working against it in service of what feels comfortable in the short term. Shadow integration means being honest about this pattern. It means asking yourself not just who hurt me, but when did I know, and why did I choose not to act on what I knew? That question is not easy, but it is the most important question on the path to real change. Because until you can answer it honestly, the pattern will repeat. New situations, new relationships, same dynamic. The specific people change, but the underlying dynamic stays the same. Jung identified 4 distinct ways that this kind of differentiated perception tends to manifest in different people. And understanding which type resonates most with your own experience can help you understand both your specific gift and your specific challenge. The first type he called the feeling intuitive. These are people who do not just perceive emotional information intellectually, they feel it in their own bodies. They absorb the emotional states of the people around them so completely that they often genuinely cannot tell the difference between their own feelings and the feelings they have taken on from someone else. If you have ever walked away from a conversation feeling inexplicably sad, angry, or anxious, and then realized several hours later that those feelings were not actually about anything in your own life, you may be a feeling intuitive. The challenge for this type is building enough psychological separation to be able to ask, in any given moment, is this mine? Where did this come from? Is this something I actually feel, or something I absorbed? The second type, Jung called the thinking intuitive. These are people whose unconscious perception tends to express itself as prediction. They see patterns in human behavior so clearly that they can often forecast with remarkable accuracy where a relationship, a career situation, or a personal dynamic is headed, sometimes months or years in advance. They are the people who say, "I knew this was going to happen," and mean it literally. Not as hindsight, but as something they actually felt and knew, and could not quite explain in a way that anyone would have believed them at the time. The challenge for this type is learning to trust and act on those predictions without needing external validation that most people will never be equipped to give them. The third type, Jung called the sensation intuitive. These are people whose perception of psychological states in others tends to register in a physical way. They can literally feel when someone is ill before that person has been diagnosed. They sense fatigue in someone who is insisting they are fine. They feel physical tension in a room where nothing has been said out loud. These individuals often describe a kind of somatic intelligence, a knowledge that lives in the body rather than in the mind, and that communicates through physical sensation rather than thought. The challenge for this type is learning to take their own physical experience seriously as a source of information, rather than dismissing it as hypersensitivity or hypochondria. And the fourth type Jung identified as the pure intuitive. This is the rarest configuration, and in many ways the most challenging. These individuals receive enormous amounts of unconscious information from their environment, but they lack what Jung called the auxiliary function, meaning they have not yet developed the psychological structures necessary to organize, interpret, or communicate what they are perceiving. They experience their extraordinary sensitivity as overwhelming and disorienting, rather than clear and useful. They are flooded with impressions they cannot quite name or explain. For this type, the most important developmental work is building internal structure, learning to create enough psychological order inside to be able to work with what they receive, rather than being swamped by it. Regardless of which of these types you most identify with, Jung believed the path forward was essentially the same. He called it the individuation process. And at its core, it is about becoming, more and more completely, who you actually are. Not who you were trained to be, not who other people needed you to be. Not the carefully managed, self-edited, constantly apologetic version of yourself that you may have been presenting to the world, but the full, authentic, psychologically integrated person underneath all of that. The first phase of this process is recognition and differentiation. This means beginning to notice the difference between your authentic inner experience and the emotional material you are absorbing from your environment. Jung recommended regular, daily periods of complete solitude as a starting practice for this. Not meditation necessarily, though that can help. Simply time alone, away from the emotional fields of other people, in which you allow yourself to settle and notice what is actually present in you versus what you were carrying from the outside. Most highly perceptive people discover, when they first begin to do this consistently, that they are far less sure about what they actually feel than they thought they were. Because they have spent so much time and energy tracking what others feel, that their own inner experience has become muffled by comparison. This is not a comfortable realization, but it is the beginning of something essential. The second phase is shadow integration, and this is the one we have already spent considerable time on. It is the process of reclaiming the parts of yourself that you were taught were unacceptable. Your boundaries, your clarity, your anger when your boundaries are violated, your authority to trust your own perceptions, your right to decide, based on your own experience, who is and is not good for you. Jung was very clear that this phase requires honesty of a particular kind. Not just honesty about what others have done to you, but honesty about the ways you have collaborated in your own suppression. The times you stayed in a situation your instincts were screaming at you to leave. The times you talked yourself out of seeing something you had already clearly seen. The times you chose someone else's comfort over your own truth. This kind of honesty is not self-punishment. It is self-knowledge. And self-knowledge is power of a particular kind that nobody can take from you. The third and final phase Jung called conscious participation. This is the stage where you begin to bring your fully integrated self into relationship with others and with the world, where you can engage deeply and empathically with other people's inner worlds without losing the thread back to your own, where you can care deeply without losing yourself, where you can be fully present with someone's pain without being consumed by it. Jung described this as the ability to serve as a bridge, someone who helps make the unconscious conscious in the people and situations around them, not by forcing or lecturing or dramatically confronting, but simply by being fully themselves, by being honest, by refusing to pretend not to see what they see, by modeling, quietly and consistently, what it looks like to be a psychologically whole person. Now I want to spend a few minutes on something that Jung identified as one of the most painful and confusing aspects of being a highly perceptive person, something he called the scapegoat phenomenon. Here is what happens. When you have the ability to perceive what others are denying, you become, simply by existing authentically in a group, a kind of mirror. You reflect back what is actually present, rather than what the group has agreed to pretend is present. And most groups are organized around a number of very specific shared agreements about what will and will not be acknowledged. Families do this, workplaces do this, friend groups do this, communities do this, societies do this. The unspoken agreements sound like things such as, we do not talk about dad's drinking. We do not acknowledge that the team is dysfunctional. We do not discuss the fact that the marriage is in trouble. We do not name what everyone already knows. And when someone with highly differentiated perception enters one of these systems, even when they are not consciously trying to name anything, their mere presence tends to create pressure on those agreements, because they can feel the gap between what is being said and what is actually true, and other people can feel them feeling it. This creates an extremely uncomfortable dynamic, because the group cannot face the mirror, and since they cannot face the mirror, they do what human beings have done with things they cannot face for as long as human beings have existed. They attack the mirror. The highly perceptive person gets labeled as the problem. They are too sensitive. They are negative. They create drama. They make everything complicated. They see issues where there are none. They are difficult. They are unstable. They need to calm down. Jung observed that this pattern is so consistent, so predictable, that it must be understood as a systemic phenomenon rather than a personal failing. It is not that there is something wrong with you because every group you enter seems to find you problematic. It is that every group you enter is being forced by your presence to confront what it would rather ignore. And instead of doing that difficult work, the group projects its discomfort onto you. Understanding this does not necessarily make it less painful. Being the designated problem, the designated difficult one, the designated unstable one, for the simple crime of perceiving accurately, is a genuinely painful experience. And if it has happened to you repeatedly, across multiple contexts, across your whole life, the damage it does to your sense of self is real and significant. but understanding it changes the meaning of the experience. It stops being evidence that you are broken. It starts being evidence that you see clearly. There is one more thing I want to address before we close, and it is the thing that I think is most important for highly perceptive people to truly internalize. Jung's research showed consistently that the transformation we have been discussing, the shift from exhausted empath to integrated, boundaried, psychologically whole person, is not a loss of sensitivity. This is critical, because many highly perceptive people resist this kind of growth because they are afraid that becoming stronger means becoming harder. They are afraid that learning to trust their own perceptions means becoming closed off. They are afraid that setting boundaries means becoming cold. They are afraid that integrating their shadow means losing the part of themselves that is genuinely, deeply, beautifully capable of love. That fear is understandable, but Jung's evidence, drawn from decades of clinical observation, says clearly that it is unfounded. The people he documented going through full psychological integration did not become less loving. They became more precisely loving. They did not become less empathic. They became selectively empathic, which means their empathy became a choice rather than a compulsion. A gift they gave freely rather than a resource that was extracted from them without their consent. They became what Jung called balanced warriors, capable of extraordinary gentleness with the people who had earned it, and equally capable of clear, firm, unambiguous self-protection against the people who had not. And this, Jung believed, is not just the healthiest possible outcome for the individual, it is a gift to the collective. Because a world full of empaths who have burned themselves to the ground trying to manage everyone else's psychological reality is not actually a more compassionate world. It is a world full of exhausted, resentful, emotionally depleted people who cannot fully show up for anyone, including themselves. But a world full of empaths who have done the work of integration, who show up whole, who see clearly and love openly, and hold firm boundaries without apology. That world looks different. That is a world that is genuinely changing. So let me close with this. If you are someone who has spent your whole life being told that you feel too much, that you care too much, that you are too intense or too perceptive or too complicated, I want to offer you a reframe. Not as comfort or as reassurance, but as an accurate description of what Jung's work actually demonstrates. You are not broken. You are not too much. You are not the problem. You are someone whose psychological architecture is tuned to a frequency that most people simply do not have access to. And for most of your life, the people around you, who either could not perceive what you were perceiving or who did not want to, taught you that this was a defect. It is not. But here is the honest part, the part that is both hopeful and demanding at the same time. The gift only becomes a gift when you do the work. Unintegrated, differentiated perception is genuinely overwhelming. It can feel like a curse. It can leave you drained and confused and isolated and unable to trust yourself or anyone else. If you do not develop the psychological structures to work with what you receive, the perception does not go away. It just becomes noise, constant, disorienting, exhausting noise. Integration is the work of turning that noise into signal, of learning to separate your experience from everyone else's, of reclaiming the shadow, the strength and the clarity and the authority you were taught to give up, of building the kind of relationship with yourself that allows you to be deeply present with other people without being consumed by them. It is real work. It takes time. It requires honesty of a kind that is genuinely uncomfortable. But Jung watched people do this work. He documented what came out the other side, and what he found waiting at the end of the integration process was not a diminished version of the sensitive person who began the journey. It was someone more fully alive than they had ever been. Someone who could finally use what they had always been given. Someone who was no longer a victim of their own perception, but its master. Jung believed this was humanity's next step, and he believed that the people who were being driven to that step first, the ones who felt too much and saw too clearly and hurt too deeply, were not the unfortunate ones. They were the pioneers. If that is you, then you are not behind. You are early. Do the work.